There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who only see the mask you wear. Elena lived with that loneliness every single day. She walked into the office each morning, smiled at the right moments, kept her head down, and pretended that the sharp words from her boss didn't cut deeper than they should. She told herself it was professional, that his arrogance was just part of working in a high-pressure environment, that the way he dismissed her ideas with barely a glance had nothing to do with her worth. But late at night, when she was alone in her small apartment, she wondered if anyone would ever see past the efficient assistant she'd become to the woman underneath who was desperate to be valued, to be heard, to matter. And then came the storm, the one that trapped them together in a place where masks couldn't survive, where the truth had nowhere to hide. And in the darkness of that night, her arrogant boss said something that shattered everything she thought she knew about him, about herself, about the invisible walls people build to keep from being hurt. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from, and if you feel it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. Your support makes all the difference. The conference was in Portland, 3 hours north of the city, and Elena had packed her bag with the same meticulous care she brought to everything in her professional life. 2 business-appropriate outfits, minimal jewelry, laptop, chargers, files for the presentation, and a small toiletry bag. She'd laid everything out the night before, checking and rechecking, because working for Damien Cross meant there was no room for error, no space for anything less than perfection. Damien was the kind of boss who noticed everything, the kind who could make you feel 2 inches tall with just a look, the kind whose approval felt like winning a prize you didn't even know you were competing for. He was the CEO of Cross Innovations, and at 36, he'd built an empire from nothing, a tech company that had revolutionized data security systems and made him one of the most sought-after minds in the industry. He was also, as far as Elena could tell, completely insufferable. She'd been his executive assistant for 18 months, and in that time, she'd learned to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, to have answers ready before he asked questions, to be invisible until she was needed, and then indispensable in that moment. It was exhausting. The hours were brutal, often 12 or 14-hour days, staying late to prepare for meetings that happened at dawn, coming in on weekends to handle crises that couldn't wait. Her friends had stopped inviting her out because she always had to cancel. Her mother worried that she was working herself into an early grave, but Elena told herself it was worth it, that this was the price of ambition, that suffering through Damien Cross's impossible standards would open doors later in her career. What she didn't tell anyone, what she barely admitted to herself, was that somewhere in the exhaustion and frustration, she'd started looking forward to those long hours, started finding reasons to stay late, even when she didn't have to, started paying attention to the small things, like the way Damien rubbed his temples when he was stressed, the way his voice softened fractionally when he was pleased with something, the rare moments when his carefully controlled expression slipped, and she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable underneath. She told herself it was professional, that understanding her boss's moods was just good strategy. But late at night, alone in her apartment, she knew it was more than that. She was fascinated by him, drawn to him in ways that terrified her, because he was her boss, and he was cold, and he would never see her as anything more than the assistant who brought his coffee black with no sugar. The morning they left for Portland, Elena had woken at 4:30. unable to sleep from a combination of nervousness about the presentation and something else, something fluttery and anxious that she refused to name. She'd showered, dressed in her most professional suit, a charcoal gray that made her look competent and forgettable, which was exactly what she wanted. She'd braided her hair into a neat plait, applied minimal makeup, and stared at herself in the mirror for a long moment, giving herself a mental pep talk. 2 days, just 2 days, alone with Damien Cross. She could handle that. She'd handled 18 months of his mood swings and impossible demands. A simple business trip would be easy in comparison. Except it wasn't easy, because from the moment she slid into the town car and caught the scent of his cologne, something woody and expensive that made her want to lean closer, she knew this trip was going to test every professional boundary she'd carefully constructed. The sky was already gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and Elena watched the clouds gathering as Marcus loaded their bags, feeling an odd sense of foreboding that she couldn't quite shake. She arrived at the office at 6:30 as instructed, with 2 coffees, black, no sugar for him, because Damien considered adding anything to coffee a sign of weakness, an actual opinion he'd once shared during a meeting when someone had ordered a caramel latte. She still remembered the withering look he'd given the unfortunate junior analyst, the way he'd said, "If you need to mask the taste of coffee, perhaps you shouldn't be drinking it." And the room had gone silent with second-hand embarrassment. Damien was already at his desk when she arrived, despite the early hour. Because of course he was. The man seemed to run on a maximum of 4 hours of sleep and pure, stubborn will. He glanced up when she entered. His eyes, a startling shade of gray-green that reminded her of storm clouds, skimming over her briefly before returning to his tablet. "Good morning, Elena," he said, his voice that low, gravelly tone that always made her spine straighten automatically. "Good morning, Mr. Cross," she replied, setting his coffee on the desk, at precisely the right distance from his keyboard, not too close to risk spills, not too far to be inconvenient. "The presentation files are loaded on both your tablet and laptop, backup copies on the cloud. I've confirmed our reservations at the Grand Hotel, and the conference organizers have your dietary restrictions on file." "Efficient as always," Damien said, and she couldn't tell if it was a compliment or just an observation. With him, it was often impossible to tell. His driver Marcus loaded their bags into the town car while Damien reviewed documents on his tablet, not acknowledging her presence beyond that brief nod. This was normal. This was how they functioned, in this careful dance of professionalism where she anticipated his needs and he accepted her service as his due. Elena slid into the seat across from him, opened her own laptop, and began going through the schedule for the next 2 days. The presentation was tomorrow morning at 9, meetings with potential investors throughout the afternoon, a networking dinner in the evening, then the drive back the following day. Simple, professional, the kind of trip they'd done a dozen times before. Except the weather forecast had changed overnight, and now there was a storm warning, a big one, the kind that shut down roads and knocked out power. Elena had seen it on the news that morning while getting ready, had felt a small flutter of anxiety, but she'd pushed it aside because Damien didn't believe in changing plans for weather, for traffic, for anything short of an actual apocalypse. They'd make it to Portland, do what needed to be done, and drive back. That was the plan. Plans, Elena had learned, were Damien's religion, the one thing he could control in a chaotic world, and deviating from them was not an option he entertained willingly. The first drops of rain started falling as they left the city limits, light at first, almost gentle, tapping against the windows like tentative fingers. Elena watched the drops race down the glass, merging and separating, creating temporary rivers that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Damien didn't look up from his tablet, his fingers moving across the screen with quick, decisive movements, probably answering emails or reviewing contracts or doing one of the 1,000 things that filled his waking hours. She'd often wondered what it was like inside his head, if it was as cold and organized as he appeared, or if there was chaos underneath the control, thoughts and feelings he kept locked away behind that impenetrable facade. By the time they were an hour into the drive, the rain had become heavy, aggressive, sheets of water that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature had dropped, and Elena could see her breath misting slightly in the cool air of the car, despite the heater running. Marcus slowed the car, his hands tight on the wheel, his shoulders tense, and for the first time, Elena saw Damien glance up, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. It was such a small tell, but she'd learned to read them over 18 months, the tiny cracks in his armor that told her when he was stressed, when he was pleased, when something had gone wrong that he was working to fix. "How much longer?" Damien asked, his voice clipped, the tone he used when he was trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. "At this speed, probably another 2 hours, sir," Marcus replied, his voice apologetic. "The storm's getting worse. I'm hearing on the radio that roads might start closing. They're talking about flash flooding in some areas." Damien's eyes flicked to Elena, as if this were somehow her fault, as if she should have anticipated that nature would be inconvenient and arranged for better weather. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first, a small act of defiance that she allowed herself, because what was he going to do? Fire her for the weather? His expression shifted slightly, something that might have been amusement or annoyance flickering across his face before he returned his attention to Marcus. "We have reservations at the Grand Hotel in downtown Portland. We'll get there." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, the kind Damien made when he expected reality to bend to his will. And usually, it did. Damien Cross had built his fortune on refusing to accept limitations, on pushing through obstacles that would have stopped lesser men, on believing that sheer determination could overcome any challenge. Elena had watched him negotiate billion-dollar deals with that same unwavering certainty, had seen him stare down investors and competitors and critics until they either bent to his vision or got out of his way. But this time, reality had other plans. This time, he was up against something that didn't care about his determination or his will or his carefully constructed plans. They made it another 40 minutes before Marcus pulled off the highway, his voice apologetic but firm. "Sir, I can't see the road anymore. The wipers can't keep up. It's not safe. We need to find somewhere to wait this out." The windshield was a solid sheet of water, the world beyond it reduced to gray blur, punctuated by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the storm in stark, terrifying detail. Elena's hands had unconsciously clenched in her lap, her knuckles white, and she forced herself to relax, to breathe, to remember that Marcus was an experienced driver and they would be fine. Damien's expression hardened, his jaw setting in that stubborn line that usually preceded an argument, but he didn't speak immediately. Elena watched him process the situation, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of risk versus reward, of pride versus safety. After a long moment, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Find us somewhere to stop." It was the closest thing to admitting defeat that Elena had ever heard from him, and the fact that he'd said it at all told her more about the severity of the storm than any weather report could have. Marcus took the next exit, winding through narrow roads that seemed to get smaller and more rural with each turn. The world outside had taken on an apocalyptic quality, trees bending nearly horizontal in the wind, debris scattered across the road, the sky so dark it might have been evening instead of mid-afternoon. Elena found herself holding her breath as they navigated around fallen branches, through standing water that seemed to rise with each passing minute. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, they found signs of civilization, a small town that barely qualified for the name, just a cluster of buildings huddled together against the storm. There was a gas station with its lights flickering, a diner that looked closed, and a motel with a neon sign that read, Pineview Inn, Vacancy, the letters buzzing and stuttering in the rain. It was the kind of place you saw in movies, the kind that time had forgotten, stuck somewhere in the 70s, with its faded paint and cracked parking lot, and the sense that nothing exciting had happened here in decades. Marcus pulled into the parking lot, the car splashing through puddles that were rapidly becoming ponds, and turned to face them. "I'll go check if they have rooms," he offered, already reaching for his jacket. "No," Damien said, surprising both Elena and Marcus. "Stay with the car. I'll handle it." He grabbed his suit jacket, which wouldn't provide much protection against the downpour, and before Elena could think better of it, she found herself speaking. "I'll come with you. 2 people asking might get better results." Damien's eyes met hers, and for a moment something passed between them, something she couldn't quite name. Then he nodded. "Let's go." They ran from the car to the motel entrance, a distance of maybe 30 feet that left them both soaked despite the brief exposure. Elena's carefully styled braid was dripping, her suit jacket plastered to her shoulders, and she could feel water squishing in her shoes with each step. Damien looked equally disheveled, his dark hair pushed back from his face, his expensive suit darkened with water, and somehow the imperfection made him more human, more approachable than she'd ever seen him. The motel lobby was small and outdated, with wood paneling that might have been fashionable 40 years ago, and carpet that had seen better decades. It smelled of old coffee and cleaning products and something musty that suggested the building had been fighting a losing battle against moisture for years. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with steel-gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, working on a crossword puzzle with the concentration of someone who took their word games seriously. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Damien in his expensive suit, soaked and dripping on her linoleum floor. "Storm's a bad one," she said, her voice raspy from years of what Elena suspected was cigarette smoking, though she couldn't smell smoke in the immediate air. "Worst we've had in 20 years, according to the weather service. You folks need rooms?" "2 rooms," Damien said immediately, pulling out his wallet with hands that Elena noticed were shaking slightly. Whether from cold or stress, she couldn't tell. "Adjoining, if possible. We have meetings in Portland tomorrow and need to be on the road as soon as the weather clears." The woman's face creased with something like sympathy, the expression of someone who was about to deliver bad news and felt genuinely sorry about it. "Only got 1 room left, honey. Storm's got everyone stranded. Highway's closed now. Won't open until morning at the earliest, maybe longer depending on flooding. Power's out in half the county. You're lucky I've got a generator running the basics, and you're lucky I've got even 1 room available. Had a family of 5 come through an hour ago, took the last of my doubles." Elena's stomach dropped. She looked at Damien, waiting for him to argue, to demand, to somehow make another room materialize through sheer force of will, the way he usually did when reality didn't align with his expectations. But for once, he seemed at a loss. His jaw worked, his eyes cutting to Elena and then away, and she could see the calculation happening behind his expression, weighing options that didn't exist, trying to find a solution to a problem that had no good answer. The silence stretched for several seconds, filled only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. Elena could feel her heart beating too fast, could feel the weight of the situation settling over her like a physical thing. One room with Damien Cross, her arrogant, impossible boss, who she absolutely should not be having inappropriate thoughts about, trapped together for the night with nowhere to escape, no professional buffer to maintain the careful distance they'd cultivated. "We'll take it," Damien said finally, his voice tight with resignation. He pulled out a credit card, slid it across the counter. "And I'll need a receipt for company records." The woman processed the payment with agonizing slowness, her arthritic fingers moving carefully over the old-fashioned credit card machine that made grinding noises as it worked. She handed them a physical key, an actual metal key attached to a plastic diamond with the number 7 stamped on it. Not a key card, but something from another era entirely. "Rooms upstairs, end of the hall, generators keeping. The heat on but not much else. I've got flashlights and candles I can bring you. Bathroom works, water's still hot for now. If you need anything else, I'm here until midnight. Then my son takes over." "Thank you," Elena said, taking the key because Damien seemed frozen, still processing the reality of what was happening. The woman smiled at her, a knowing smile that suggested she'd seen plenty of awkward situations in her years running this motel, and found this one mildly amusing. They went back out into the storm to help Marcos with their bags, the three of them working quickly to grab luggage and Damien's briefcase before getting soaked again. Marcus looked at them with barely concealed concern. "Sir, I can try to find another place, maybe in the next town." "No," Damien said, his tone brooking no argument. "Roads are dangerous and getting worse. There's a diner next door that looks like it might still be open. Get yourself some food. Find somewhere warm to wait this out. We'll text you when we're ready to leave tomorrow." After some more convincing, Marcus finally agreed, clearly relieved to be dismissed from this increasingly awkward situation. Elena watched the taillights of the car disappear into the rain, feeling like her last connection to normalcy was driving away, leaving her stranded in a surreal situation that couldn't possibly be happening. The room was exactly what Elena had expected from a motel called Pineview Inn, small and outdated, with floral wallpaper that might have been charming in 1975, but now just looked tired, furniture that had seen better decades, and a slightly musty smell that no amount of air freshener could quite mask. There was one bed, a queen, covered in a faded quilt with a pattern of roses that had washed out to pale pink and gray. A small bathroom with cracked tile but, as promised, running water. A window that rattled ominously with each gust of wind, the glass old and single-paned, offering minimal protection against the storm's fury. A dresser with a television that probably got 3 channels on a good day. And absolutely no cell service, which Elena discovered the moment she tried to call the hotel in Portland to cancel their reservations, her phone showing the dreaded "no service" message that made her feel cut off from the world. Damien stood in the middle of the room, still dripping, looking more out of place than Elena had ever seen him. This man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals with unwavering confidence seemed genuinely uncertain. his usual armor of arrogance unable to protect him from the awkwardness of this situation. He set his briefcase down carefully, then just stood there, his hands hanging at his sides, clearly at a loss for what to do next. The knock on the door made them both jump. It was the woman from the front desk, her arms full of supplies, flashlights, candles, matches, extra blankets, and even a thermos of what she explained was hot soup. "Storm knocked out power in most of the county about an hour ago," she said, setting everything on the dresser with practiced efficiency. "Generator'll keep the heat on and the water running. But that's about all. You folks need anything else, you come find me. Name's Margaret, by the way. You're welcome to wait out the storm in the lobby if you'd rather have company. Got coffee down there and some board games, if you're interested." "Thank you, Margaret," Elena said warmly, grateful for the kindness in the woman's eyes. "We'll be fine." When Margaret left, her footsteps creaking down the hallway, the silence that fell was heavy, weighted with everything they weren't saying. Elena could hear the storm battering the building, could hear Damien's breathing, slightly faster than normal, could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. The room suddenly felt very small, the walls pressing in, the single bed dominating the space like an elephant no one wanted to acknowledge. "I'll sleep on the floor," Elena said quickly, needing to fill the silence with something, anything. "Don't be ridiculous," Damien replied, his voice sharp, the familiar tone of command snapping back into place, like armor being reassembled. "The bed's big enough. We're both adults. We can share a bed for one night without it being inappropriate." His tone suggested the matter was closed, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost like discomfort, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist on the floor, because at least that would maintain some semblance of professional distance. But she was cold and wet and tired, and the thought of spending the night on a questionable carpet was deeply unappealing. "Fine," she said, then immediately felt awkward about how that had sounded. Too agreeable, not professional enough. "I mean, that's acceptable. Thank you." Damien made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. She couldn't tell. He moved to the window, looking out at the storm, his profile sharp against the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked glass. Elena took the opportunity to escape to the bathroom, needing a moment alone to process everything that was happening, to get control of the thoughts spiraling through her mind. The bathroom was tiny but functional, the shower curtain printed with faded seahorses, the mirror spotted with age. Elena looked at herself in the mirror, at her ruined makeup and dripping hair and the wild look in her own eyes, and wondered what she'd done in a past life to deserve this particular cosmic joke. Trapped in a motel room with Damien Cross. One bed, no escape. This was either going to be the most awkward night of her life, or something else entirely, something she was afraid to even name. She changed out of her wetsuit into the only casual clothes she'd brought, yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt that had belonged to an ex-boyfriend and that she'd kept because it was comfortable, not because she thought about him at all anymore. She wrung out her hair as best she could, braided it again to keep it out of her face, and gave herself a stern talking to in the mirror. Professional? Distant? Just get through the night. Tomorrow the storm would clear. They'd drive to Portland, do the presentation, and pretend this never happened. When she emerged from the bathroom, Damien had changed too, though she hadn't heard him moving around. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple black sweater, clothes she'd never seen him in because at the office he lived in expensive suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The casual clothes made him look different, Younger somehow, less intimidating, more human. His hair was still damp, pushed back from his face, and without the armor of his suit, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were shoved into his pockets, as if he didn't know what else to do with them. "Bathroom's yours," she said, her voice coming out slightly too high, slightly too bright. He nodded, grabbed his bag, and disappeared into the bathroom without a word. Elena heard the water running, heard him moving around, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that Damien Cross was showering just a few feet away from her, separated only by a thin door and her own self-control. The storm intensified as darkness fell, the afternoon giving way to evening that came early thanks to the thick cloud cover. Wind howled against the building like something alive and angry, rain hammering the roof in waves that sounded like fists pounding, demanding entry. The room grew colder despite the generator, the old windows providing minimal insulation, and Elena wrapped her arms around herself, wishing she'd packed warmer clothes, wishing she was anywhere but here, wishing she could stop noticing how small the room was and how big the bed looked, and how inappropriate every thought in her head had become. Damien emerged from the bathroom, his hair still damp, his feet bare, looking so completely different from the cold CEO she worked for that Elena had to remind herself this was the same person who'd made a junior analyst cry last week for missing a decimal point in a report. They stood there for a moment, two people who spent 40 hours a week together, suddenly rendered speechless by the removal of their professional context. "Are you cold?" Damien asked, and Elena startled at the question, at the fact that he'd noticed, at the unexpected concern in his voice. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the response she always gave, the one that kept her safely in her role as the efficient assistant who never needed anything, never complained, never showed weakness. Damien made a sound that clearly indicated he didn't believe her. He crossed to his bag, pulled out a cashmere sweater in dark gray, and tossed it to her. "Put that on before you freeze." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, delivered in the same tone he used to delegate tasks at the office. But there was something different underneath it, something almost protective that made Elena's chest tighten in a way she didn't want to examine. She caught the sweater, the fabric impossibly soft under her fingers, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, something woody and expensive that she'd come to associate with early mornings and late nights, and the particular kind of stress that came with working for someone who demanded perfection. "Thank you," she said quietly, pulling the sweater on over her sweatshirt. It was too large, the sleeves hanging past her hands, the hem falling to mid-thigh, but it was warm and somehow comforting, like being wrapped in something safe. Damien's eyes followed the movement, tracked the way the sweater engulfed her smaller frame, and something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like pain before his expression shuttered again. He turned back to the window as if standing guard against the storm, his shoulders tense, his hands shoved back into his pockets. The silence stretched between them. But it wasn't the comfortable silence of the office where they both had roles to play, tasks to complete. This was different, heavier, charged with something Elena couldn't name, but could feel pulsing in the air between them like electricity before lightning strikes. She sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make herself small, trying not to think about the fact that they would eventually have to sleep, to lie next to each other in the darkness, to maintain some semblance of professionalism in a situation that had stripped away all the normal boundaries that kept their relationship safely contained. "I should apologize," Damien said suddenly, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain, and Elena's head snapped up because those were words she never expected to hear from him. "For what?" she asked, genuinely confused. He turned from the window, and in the dim light from the candles Margaret had left, his face looked different. The harsh angles softened, the cold control cracking to show something raw underneath. "For the way I've treated you, for the past 18 months, for making you feel like you're not valued when you're the most competent person I've ever worked with, for being so focused on maintaining distance that I never acknowledged how essential you are, not just to my work, but to my ability to function at all." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, unexpected and disorienting. She opened her mouth, closed it, completely at a loss for how to respond. Damien Cross didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge mistakes. He certainly didn't give compliments, let alone ones that suggested he'd been paying attention, that he'd seen her struggling under the weight of his impossible standards, that he'd noticed her at all beyond her utility. "I don't understand," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so uncharacteristically uncertain that it made him look younger, more vulnerable, almost like a different person entirely. "I know you don't. How could you? I've gone out of my way to make sure no one sees anything but the arrogant bastard who demands perfection and gives nothing back. The CEO who treats people like resources instead of human beings. The man who's built an empire on the backs of employees he never bothers to appreciate." He moved to the small chair near the bed, sat down heavily, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him. The posture was so unlike him, so openly defeated, that Elena felt something shift in her chest, some of the resentment she'd been carrying for 18 months beginning to crack and splinter. "But you should know, Elena. You deserve to know. You're not invisible to me. You never have been." The storm outside seemed to quiet, or maybe Elena had just stopped hearing it. Her entire focus narrowed to the man in front of her who was saying things that rewrote everything she thought she understood about their relationship, about him, about the past year and a half of her life. "Then why?" she asked, and was surprised to find her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Why treat me like I don't matter? Why make every day feel like a test I'm constantly failing?" "Because you matter too much," Damien said, and the confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and completely unexpected. His eyes met hers, and she saw pain there, real pain, the kind that came from years of self-protection and loneliness and fear. "Because from the first day you walked into my office, I knew you were dangerous to every wall I've spent 15 years building. Because I'm terrified of what happens if I let you in, and you see what's underneath all this." He gestured to himself, a movement encompassing the expensive clothes, the cold demeanor, the carefully constructed image of the successful CEO who had everything under control. "Because I've spent my entire adult life convincing myself that being alone is safer than being vulnerable, that needing people is weakness, that if I just work hard enough and succeed enough and build enough walls, I'll never have to risk being hurt again." Elena's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in every part of her body that was suddenly hyper-aware of everything about this moment. "What's underneath?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. Damien looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes were filled with something that looked like pain, like exhaustion, like a man who'd been holding up the world and was finally admitting the weight was too much. Someone who's been alone for so long, he forgot how to be anything else. Someone who pushes people away before they can leave. because that's easier than risking abandonment. Someone who's convinced that if anyone saw the real him, saw past the success and the money and the carefully controlled image, they'd run. His voice dropped lower, rougher, thick with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. Someone who's been half in love with his assistant for over a year and has no idea what to do about it because every relationship he's ever had has ended the same way, with him being too much or not enough, too demanding or too distant, never quite right, never quite enough to make someone stay. The world tilted. Elena gripped the edge of the bed, her knuckles white, trying to process what he'd just said, trying to reconcile this vulnerable, honest man with the cold boss who'd barely acknowledged her existence beyond her usefulness. "You don't mean that," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true, because Damien Cross didn't say things he didn't mean, didn't make confessions lightly, didn't show weakness unless it was genuine. "I do," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I've never meant anything more in my life, and that terrifies me more than any business deal, any risk, any failure ever has." He stood, paced to the window and back, restless energy contained in the small space, like a caged animal finally acknowledging the bars it had built around itself. "I know this is inappropriate," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken and he couldn't stop them even if he wanted to. "I know I'm your boss, and this crosses every professional line that exists. I know I have no right to tell you any of this when I've done nothing but make your life difficult, when I've hidden behind professional distance and impossible standards because I was too afraid to admit what I was really feeling." He stopped pacing, stood in the middle of the small room, looking lost in a way Elena had never seen him. "But we're trapped here, Elena, and for once in my life, I can't hide behind work, behind demands, behind the mask I wear to keep people at a distance. There are no meetings to prepare for, no reports to review, no professional buffer to protect me from the truth. And I'm tired. God, I'm so tired of pretending." He took a shaky breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I'm tired of pretending I don't notice the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating on something difficult. The way you always bring me coffee, even though I never thank you, even though I act like it's your job, and not a kindness you don't have to extend. The way you stay late without complaint, the way you somehow always know what I need before I know I need it, the way you've been holding my entire professional life together while I treat you like you're just another employee instead of the reason I can function at all." His eyes found hers again, and the raw honesty there made Elena's breath catch. "I notice the way you look at me sometimes, Elena, like you're trying to figure out if there's a real person underneath all the ice, like you're searching for something worth caring about. And I've spent 18 months trying not to hope that you might find it, because hope is dangerous, and vulnerability is terrifying, and I've built my entire life on never needing anyone, never letting anyone close enough to hurt me." The candles flickered in the draft from the window, casting dancing shadows on the walls that made the moment feel surreal, like something happening outside of time and space and normal reality. Elena couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at him as 18 months of interactions replayed in her mind through this new lens, every moment suddenly transformed from what she'd thought it was into something else entirely. The times he'd snapped at her and then later quietly left a bonus in her paycheck, usually on days when she'd stayed particularly late or handled a particularly difficult situation. The way he positioned himself between her and difficult clients during meetings, protecting her while pretending not to notice he was doing it. The morning he'd arrived with her favorite tea, the exact brand and flavor she preferred, after she'd mentioned once, months ago in passing, that she found it more soothing than coffee. The time he'd cancelled a meeting with a major investor because she'd called in sick, saying he couldn't function without his assistant, his voice carrying a concern that went beyond professional inconvenience. Details she'd dismissed as coincidence or professional courtesy suddenly reshaping themselves into something else entirely, into a pattern of caring disguised as coldness, of attention masked as indifference, of a man who'd been protecting himself by pushing away the one person he actually wanted close. "I don't know what to say," Elena whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "You don't have to say anything," Damien replied, moving back to the chair, carefully maintaining distance between them as if afraid of what might happen if he got too close, as if proximity might shatter whatever control he still had left. "I just needed you to know, needed to stop lying to both of us about what this is, about what I feel, whatever happens after tonight, after we leave this room and go back to our normal lives and our professional roles. At least you'll know the truth. At least I'll have been honest once in my life about something that matters." The storm continued its assault outside, but inside the small room, something had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible, like a fault line finally giving way after years of pressure building underneath. Elena looked at this man who'd terrified and frustrated her in equal measure, this man who'd just stripped away his armor and shown her the wounds underneath, and she made a decision that would change everything. She stood, crossed the small distance between them, and knelt in front of his chair so they were at eye level, so she could look directly into his eyes and make sure he understood that what she was about to say was as honest as what he'd just confessed. "My turn?" she said, her voice steady despite the fear fluttering in her chest, like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "I've spent 18 months convincing myself I hated you," she began, and saw his eyes widen, saw him start to pull back. But she reached out and caught his hands, held them in hers, felt the calluses on his fingers that came from hours working with precision tools on his personal projects, the hobby he thought no one knew about. "Let me finish. I spent 18 months convincing myself that my heart racing, every time you walked into a room, was anxiety, not attraction. That the way I couldn't sleep before days when I knew we'd be working closely together was dread, not anticipation. That staying late was about job security and career advancement, not about getting a few more minutes near you, a few more chances to see you relax fractionally when everyone else had gone home." She saw his breath catch, saw something like hope flicker across his face before he could hide it. "I convinced myself that noticing what you needed before you asked was just me being good at my job, not because I'd studied you like you were a language I desperately wanted to speak. Like if I just paid enough attention, I could decode the mystery of who you really were underneath the image you showed the world. I told myself you were arrogant, cold, impossible to please. And you are all those things, Damien. You really are." His face fell slightly at that, but she squeezed his hands, held his gaze. "But you're also brilliant in a way that makes me want to be smarter just to keep up with you. You're driven by something deeper than money or success, by some need to prove yourself that I recognize because I have it too. And underneath everything, underneath the coldness and the impossible standards and the walls you've built, you're lonely in a way I recognized from the very first day because I feel it too. That specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who only see what you show them. never who you actually are. She saw his eyes fill with tears, saw him trying to blink them back, trying to maintain control even as everything he'd built to protect himself was crumbling. "I see you," she said softly but firmly, needing him to understand, needing him to believe. Not the CEO, not the boss, not the image you project. "I see the person who stays at the office until midnight, because going home to an empty apartment is worse than working. I see the man who remembers every employee's birthday, even though you pretend you don't care. I see someone who's terrified of being vulnerable because everyone who was supposed to love you left, and you decided it was safer to be alone than to risk that pain again." A tear escaped, tracking down his cheek, and Elena reached up with one hand, wiped it away with her thumb, felt him lean into the touch like a man starving for gentleness. "I see all of that, Damien. I see the person underneath, and I'm not running. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Something in him broke then. She could see it happen, could see the moment when the last wall crumbled, when the mask fell completely away. He pulled her up and into his arms in one smooth motion, his strength surprising her, even though she should have expected it, and buried his face in her hair, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and uncertain. She wrapped her arms around him, felt the tension in his body, felt him shaking slightly, as if the act of being held, truly held by someone who knew what he was and wanted him anyway, was almost too much to bear. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted against her shoulder, his voice muffled but raw with honesty. "I don't know how to be vulnerable, how to let someone in without destroying everything. I don't know how to need someone and not eventually push them away. Every relationship I've ever had has ended the same way, with me being too intense, too demanding, too focused on work, too emotionally unavailable. I don't know how to be different." "Neither do I," Elena replied, her own voice thick with emotion, with the weight of her own fears and insecurities finally being spoken aloud. "I don't know how to be enough for someone like you. I don't know how to stop making myself small and useful and necessary, because that's the only way I've ever known how to matter to people. I don't know how to believe that I'm wanted for who I am instead of what I can do." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim candlelight, the storm raging outside, while something else entirely raged inside, something equally powerful but infinitely more important. Minutes blurred into each other, marked only by the sound of rain and their breathing gradually synchronizing. Two people who had been orbiting each other for 18 months finally colliding. When Damien finally pulled back, his eyes were red-rimmed, his face open in a way Elena had never seen. Every defense stripped away, leaving only honesty and hope and fear in equal measure. She reached up instinctively, wiped away the dampness on his cheek with her thumb, and he caught her hand, held it against his face for a moment before turning his head to press a kiss to her palm that sent electricity shooting up her arm and straight to her heart. "I want to kiss you," he said, his voice rough and low and full of longing that he'd clearly been suppressing for far too long. "I've wanted to kiss you for so long, it's become a constant ache, something I think about at inappropriate moments during meetings, something that keeps me awake at night. But I need you to tell me it's okay. I need you to be sure, because once I cross this line, once I let myself have this, I don't know if I'll be able to go back to pretending." Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in his presence. One born not from professional necessity or polite courtesy, but from real joy, from the exhilaration of finally acknowledging what had been building between them for so long. "I'm sure," she said. And then, because it wasn't quite enough, because she needed him to understand how much she meant it, she added, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Kiss me, Damien." He kissed her like a man who'd been starving, like she was air and he'd been drowning, with a desperation tempered by surprising gentleness, his hands cradling her face, as if she were something precious and fragile that he was terrified of breaking. Elena kissed him back, pouring 18 months of suppressed feelings into it, all the frustration and longing and secret desire she'd hidden behind professional courtesy and careful distance, all the nights she'd gone home and tried not to think about him, all the mornings she'd woken up early just to have extra time to prepare for seeing him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, foreheads resting together, Damien's hands still cupping her face, like he couldn't quite believe she was real, that this was happening. "This changes everything," he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. "I know," Elena replied, equally quiet, equally aware of the magnitude of what they'd just done. "We'll have to figure out how to handle it at work. The company has policies about relationships between supervisors and subordinates. There will be paperwork, disclosure forms. Possibly one of us will need to transfer to a different department." "I know. People will talk. They'll say you slept your way to whatever position you have. They'll say, I'm taking advantage of my authority. They'll make assumptions and judgments, and it will be uncomfortable." "I know. My last relationship ended because she said I was married to my work, that I cared more about the company than about her. She wasn't wrong. I don't know if I can be different, if I can give you what you deserve." "I know," Elena said again, but this time she pulled back slightly so she could look at him directly. "I know all of that, Damien. I know it won't be easy. I know there will be complications and challenges and moments when we'll wonder if this was a mistake. But I also know that what I feel for you isn't going away. That pretending it doesn't exist hasn't worked for 18 months and won't work going forward. That I'd rather face all those complications with honesty than spend the rest of my career wondering what if." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face, made him look younger, happier, free from the weight of the armor he usually wore. "You're not making this easy. When have I ever made anything easy for you?" Elena teased, feeling suddenly light, almost giddy with the relief of finally being honest, of finally dropping the pretense. "Never," Damien laughed, an actual laugh, deep and genuine and full of joy. And Elena realized with a start that she'd never heard him laugh before. Not really, not like this. "You've been making my life difficult from day one, questioning my decisions, pushing back on unreasonable demands, refusing to be intimidated by me like everyone else. It's one of the things I love about you." The word hung between them, acknowledged but not pressed, an admission that could wait for later when they'd both had time to process the magnitude of what was happening, when they were ready to fully embrace what it meant. For now it was enough to be here, to be honest, to be together without the weight of pretense or fear or professional distance. They talked through the night, the storm providing a strange kind of cocoon, isolating them from the world and all its complications, giving them this one pocket of time where nothing existed except honesty and possibility. Damien told her about his childhood, about parents who'd loved him fiercely but died in a car accident when he was 22, leaving him alone just when he was figuring out who he wanted to be, about building his company from nothing because he had to prove he could survive alone, because creating something successful felt like the only way to honor their memory and show that their love hadn't been wasted. about learning that vulnerability was weakness, that showing emotion was dangerous, that the only way to protect yourself was to never let anyone close enough to hurt you, about relationships that had failed because he didn't know how to balance work and intimacy, because he'd been programmed to believe that success required sacrifice and that personal happiness was somehow less important than professional achievement. Elena shared her own story about being the middle child in a family of high achievers, about always feeling like she had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition, about making herself useful so she'd be valued, since being loved for who she was felt too risky, about the fear of being ordinary, of not mattering, of spending her life in the background of other people's stories, supporting their dreams while her own withered from neglect, about choosing to be an assistant because it felt safe, because anticipating other people's needs meant she didn't have to figure out her own, because being essential to someone else's success felt easier than risking her own potential failure. They discovered they were both carrying versions of the same wound, the same fundamental fear of not being enough, of being too much, of never finding someone who could see all of them, the messy and the magnificent, the broken and the beautiful, and choose to stay anyway. They talked about the early days of working together, laughing now about moments that had felt impossibly tense at the time, reframing interactions through their new understanding of what had actually been happening underneath the surface. As dawn broke, pale and watery through the window, the storm finally beginning to ease to a steady rain instead of the violent downpour that had trapped them here, they lay on the bed fully clothed, facing each other, fingers intertwined between them. The candles had burned down to nubs, and the first genuine light of morning was creeping through the cracks in the curtains, painting everything in soft gray tones. "What happens now?" Elena asked, her voice soft in the quiet morning. The storm's fury finally spent, leaving only gentle persistence. Damien traced the line of her knuckles with his thumb, the gesture absurdly intimate, given everything they'd shared through the night. "Now we go to Portland, assuming the roads are passable. We do the presentation like nothing happened. We act professional, maintain distance, be the efficient CEO and his competent assistant that everyone expects." He paused, his eyes serious, making sure she understood what he was about to say. "And when we get back to the city, after we've had time to sleep and process and make sure this wasn't just some storm-induced temporary insanity, we have dinner, a real dinner, not working, not reviewing notes or preparing for meetings, just us, and we talk about what this means, how we want to move forward, whether we're brave enough to try this for real." "And if it can't work?" Elena asked, voicing the fear that was lurking underneath everything, the possibility that this night would remain a beautiful anomaly that couldn't survive in the harsh light of their normal lives. "Then at least we were honest," Damien said, pulling her closer, tucking her head under his chin. "At least we tried, at least we gave ourselves the chance, instead of wondering forever what might have been. But Elena?" He waited until she looked up at him. "I think it will work. I think you're brave enough for both of us. And I think what happened here tonight was just us finally admitting what's been true for a long time." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, exhausted from emotional honesty and stayed awake too long, talking, and when Elena woke a few hours later to genuine sunlight streaming through the window, the storm completely passed. She found Damien already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. "Good morning," he said softly, and something about the way he said it, like this was the first morning of a new beginning, made everything feel real in a way it hadn't the night before. "Good morning," she replied, and the world felt new, full of possibility, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. They made it to Portland by noon, the roads cleared but still wet, evidence of the storm's fury visible in fallen branches and scattered debris. They checked into the hotel with professional efficiency, separate rooms as originally planned, even though both of them knew that line had been crossed and couldn't be uncrossed. They prepared for the presentation with their usual coordination, but everything felt different now, charged with new meaning. The presentation itself was a triumph. Damien's vision and Elena's organizational skills combining to create something that had investors practically throwing money at them, wanting to be part of whatever Cross Innovations was building. To anyone watching, they were the same boss and assistant they'd always been. Competent, coordinated, perfectly in sync. But Elena could feel the difference, could sense it in the way Damien's eyes would find hers across the room, in the small private smile that played at the corner of his mouth when she handed him documents, in the careful space he maintained between them that was somehow more intimate than touching would have been, because they both knew what they were resisting. On the drive back to the city the next day, Marcus at the wheel, Damien worked on his tablet while Elena reviewed notes, and to anyone observing, nothing had changed. But under the papers between them on the seat, their fingers were intertwined, hidden and precious, a secret connection that felt more significant than any public declaration could have been. When they arrived at the office, Damien turned to her before getting out of the car, his voice low enough that Marcus couldn't hear. "Dinner tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up." "That's not a question," Eleanor observed, fighting a smile. "No," Damien agreed, his eyes warm with something that looked like happiness, like hope, like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, but both wanted desperately to explore. "It's not. Send me your address." That night, alone in her apartment, Eleanor replayed everything that had happened, still half convinced it had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination, that she'd imagined the vulnerability in Damien's eyes, the confessions he'd made, the way he'd held her like she was something precious. But her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that she somehow knew was him before she even read it. "Thank you for seeing me, for staying, for being brave enough to be honest. I'm terrified and hopeful, and I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to try, if you'll let me." She saved the number under his name, her fingers shaking slightly as she typed back. "I'm terrified, too. But yes, let's try. Let's see if we're brave enough to build something real." His response came almost immediately. "We are. I'll prove it to you. Starting tomorrow." Eleanor fell asleep smiling, something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember, thinking about possibilities instead of limitations, about futures instead of fears. The next evening, Damien picked her up in his own car, a sleek BMW that she'd only seen in the executive parking garage, wearing jeans and a casual button-down instead of a suit, looking so different from the intimidating CEO she'd worked for that she almost didn't recognize him. He took her to a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood she'd never been to, somewhere quiet and intimate, where no one from the office would see them, where they could just be two people exploring something new and terrifying and wonderful. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about dreams and fears, and the strange path that had brought them to this moment, about music and books and the parts of themselves they usually kept hidden. "I don't want to hide you," Damien said over dessert, his hand covering hers on the table, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. "But I also don't want to make your life difficult. We'll have to be careful at work, At least until we figure out if this is real, if it can last, if we can navigate all the complications without destroying what we're building." "It's real," Elena said with certainty she didn't know she possessed, surprising herself with her own conviction. "I don't know if it will last, and I don't know if we'll be able to figure everything out. But what I feel, that's real. This is real." He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. We'll figure out the complications as they come. We'll be honest with each other even when it's hard, and we'll see if what we found in that storm can survive in the real world." They did exactly that. For the next 3 months they maintained perfect professionalism at the office, no one suspecting that the cold CEO and his efficient assistant were spending every evening together, learning each other, building something fragile and precious in the privacy of their personal lives. Damien was different outside the office, softer in ways that surprised Elena, funnier than she'd expected, still intense but in ways that made her feel cherished rather than pressured. He cooked for her, badly but enthusiastically, burning pasta and oversalting vegetables while she laughed and helped him salvage dinner. He listened when she talked about her dreams of maybe doing something more than being an assistant, of using her business degree for something beyond managing someone else's schedule, of taking risks she'd been too afraid to take before. He encouraged her to apply for positions in other departments, even though it meant he'd lose the best assistant he'd ever had, even though it would make his life measurably more difficult. "I'd rather see you happy and fulfilled than keep you in a role that limits you," he said one night as they lay tangled together on his couch, her head on his chest, his fingers playing with her hair. "Even if it means I have to suffer through someone who doesn't anticipate my every need, who doesn't understand that I need coffee at specific times, who doesn't know how to manage my schedule the way you do." "You'll survive?" Elena teased, then grew serious, propping herself up to look at him. "But I don't want to leave. Not yet. I want to figure out what we are first. I want to make sure this is stable before I change everything else. We're people who are falling in love," Damien said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Everything else is just details we'll figure out." The office eventually noticed something had changed, though no one could quite put their finger on what it was. The tension between Damien and Elena had transformed into something different, something that felt almost like contentment. He was fractionally gentler when he spoke to her, his corrections more constructive than cutting. She smiled more, laughed occasionally at things he said, seemed less stressed despite the demanding workload. People speculated, of course they did, but there was nothing concrete to point to, no smoking gun. Just a sense that something had shifted in ways no one could quite articulate. When Elena finally accepted a position as a junior strategist in the innovation department, 5 months after the storm that had changed everything, Damien announced it in a company meeting with genuine pride that surprised everyone who was used to his usual cold professionalism. "Elena has been invaluable to this company and to me personally," he said, his eyes finding hers across the conference room, holding her gaze for just a moment too long. "And I'm pleased to see her talents recognized and utilized in a role that will allow her to contribute even more significantly to our continued success." After the meeting, he stopped by her desk, maintaining professional distance but unable to completely hide the warmth in his eyes. "Dinner tonight to celebrate your new position." "That's still not a question," Eleanor observed, gathering her things. "Will it ever be?" he asked, smiling in that way that was reserved only for her. "Probably not," she admitted, matching his smile. "I'll see you at 7. That night, over champagne at the same Italian restaurant where they'd had their first real date, Damien took her hand across the table, his expression nervous in a way she'd learned meant he was about to say something important. "I have something to say, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Can you do that for me?" Elena's heart started racing, but she nodded, interlacing her fingers with his, giving him silent permission to continue. "These past 5 months have been the happiest of my life," he began, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide anymore. "You've changed everything, Elena. You've shown me that I don't have to choose between success and connection, that vulnerability isn't weakness, that letting someone in doesn't mean losing myself or my drive or my ability to function. You've been patient with my fears, gentle with my walls, fierce in your insistence that I'm worth loving even when I couldn't see it myself, even when I pushed back or retreated into old patterns." He paused, took a breath, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I know it's fast. I know we're still figuring things out, still navigating complications. But Elena, you made me believe in futures again, in tomorrows, in possibilities I thought I'd given up on. You made me want to be better, not because you demanded it, but because you made me believe I could be. And I don't want to do life without you. I don't want to wake up without you. I don't want to face hard days or celebrate victories or just exist in the mundane moments of daily life with anyone but you." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and Elena's breath stopped, her heart hammering, so loud she was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it. "I'm not asking you to marry me," he said quickly, seeing her eyes widen. "Not yet, not until you're ready. But I'm asking you to think about it, to consider building a future with me officially, permanently, when the time is right." He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a single stone that caught the candlelight and scattered it in rainbow prisms across the table. "This is a promise that I'll keep choosing you every day, even when it's hard, even when we fight, even when work gets overwhelming. That I'll keep working on being the kind of man who deserves you, who can give you the life and love you deserve. That I'll keep building a life where you can thrive, not just survive, where you can be everything you're capable of being." Elena's eyes filled with tears, the good kind, the kind that came from overwhelming emotion rather than pain, from joy rather than sorrow. "Damien," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't have to answer now," he said quickly, misreading her tears. "Take your time. Think about it. Talk to your family, your friends. Make sure this is what you want. I just needed you to know where my heart is, where it's been for longer than 5 months, if I'm being completely honest." Elena laughed through her tears, shaking her head, pulling his hand closer. "You're an idiot if you think I need time to think about this." She held out her left hand, steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "Yes, not someday. Yes now. Yes to building a future. Yes to you. Yes to all of it." His hand trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger, and when he looked up at her, his own eyes were wet, tears he didn't bother hiding or apologizing for. "You're sure? You're absolutely certain?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my entire life," Elena replied firmly. "I love you, Damien. I think I have for longer than either of us realized. And yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes, I want all the complications and challenges and beautiful moments. Yes, to everything." He came around the table so fast, he almost knocked his chair over, pulled her to her feet, kissed her right there in the middle of the restaurant, while the other diners smiled and applauded. some of them calling out congratulations and well wishes. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying, Damien held her face between his hands. "I spent so long thinking I was too much," he said softly, his forehead pressed to hers. "Too demanding, too intense, too damaged, too focused on work, that I'd never find someone who could handle all of me, who wouldn't eventually get tired of my intensity or my demands, or my inability to ever fully relax." "You're not too much," Elena told him, meaning every word, her hands covering his where they still cupped her face. "You just needed to find someone big enough to love you completely, someone strong enough to match your intensity, patient enough to weather your moods, brave enough to call you on your bullshit. And I am. I always have been." They went back to his apartment that night, to the space that had gradually become theirs over the past months, her things migrating there gradually, until half his closet was her clothes, and her favorite tea lived in his kitchen, and her books were stacked on his coffee table. They talked until dawn about what their future would look like, about the official disclosure they'd need to make to HR about their relationship now that Elena had moved departments, about when and how to tell their families, about the wedding they both wanted, small and intimate, about the life they wanted to build together. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, moments when Damien's old walls tried to reassert themselves, and he retreated into cold professionalism without meaning to. Times when Elena's insecurity whispered that she wasn't enough, that eventually he'd realize he could do better, someone more successful or more sophisticated or more something. But they worked through it together, learning that love wasn't about never struggling, about always being happy and in sync, but about choosing to stay and fight for each other even when it was difficult, about being honest even when the truth was uncomfortable, about building something strong enough to weather storms because they'd already survived the one that brought them together. 6 months later, Damien stood in front of the company's board of directors and disclosed their relationship officially, knowing it would complicate things, knowing some would question his judgment or wonder about favoritism, but refusing to hide the best thing that had ever happened to him. Elena stood beside him, no longer his assistant, but his equal, his partner, wearing the engagement ring he'd given her proudly. And when some of the older board members expressed concern about propriety, about appearances, about setting the wrong example, Damien's response was simple and unwavering. "I built this company from nothing. I've given 15 years of my life to making it succeed, to building something that matters. And in that time, I've learned that success means nothing if you're alone, that professional achievement is hollow if you have no one to share it with, that all the money and power in the world can't fill the emptiness of going home to no one who cares whether you had a good day or a bad one." He looked at Elena, his expression soft. "Elena makes me better at my job, not worse. She challenges me, grounds me, helps me make wiser decisions, because she's not afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. She makes me remember that the people who work here are human beings, not just resources. If you have a problem with that, if you think my personal happiness somehow compromises my professional judgment, I'll accept your resignation effective immediately. But I won't apologize for choosing to build a life with someone who sees me clearly and loves me anyway." The room was silent for a long moment before the chairman, a man who'd known Damien since the early days of the company, smiled. "I think I speak for the entire board when I say congratulations. It's about time someone made an honest man out of you, Cross. Now let's move on to the quarterly reports." No one resigned, and slowly, the office adjusted to the reality of their CEO in a relationship, softened by love, but no less effective. Maybe even more so because he seemed more present, more engaged with people instead of just processes, more willing to listen instead of just dictate. A year after the storm, on a beautiful autumn afternoon with leaves turning gold and red, they stood in front of their friends and family in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside the city and promised forever to each other officially. Elena wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers, refusing the elaborate wedding her mother had wanted because she wanted something authentic, something that felt like them. Damien cried through his vows, unashamed of the emotion, his voice breaking as he promised to love her in sickness and health, in good times and bad, in success and failure, for all the days of his life. And when they kissed as husband and wife, the applause was deafening, everyone who knew them celebrating not just a marriage, but a transformation they'd all witnessed. At the reception, dancing in the golden light of sunset, Damien pulled Elena close, holding her like he never wanted to let go. "Do you remember what I said to you that night in the motel?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the music. "Which part? You said a lot of things that night. That I'd been half in love with you for over a year." Elena smiled, remembering that confession, how earth-shattering it had felt in the moment. "I remember." "I was wrong," Damien said, his eyes serious despite the smile on his face. "I wasn't half in love. I was completely, devastatingly, irreversibly in love with you from the moment you walked into my office for your interview and looked at me like you could see straight through all my bullshit to the person underneath. From the moment you answered my impossible question about your greatest weakness by telling me it was that you cared too much about doing things right, and I knew you were either the best liar I'd ever met or the most genuine person I'd ever encountered. I just didn't have the courage to admit it, to myself or to you, until the storm took away all my excuses and left me with nowhere to hide." Elena rested her head on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, thinking about how far they'd come from that first day, from those 18 months of professional distance, from the night everything changed. "Then I guess we should thank that storm." "Every day," Damien agreed, kissing the top of her head. "Every single day for the rest of our lives." They danced until the stars came out, surrounded by people who loved them, celebrating not just a wedding, but the courage it had taken to be vulnerable, to be honest, to risk everything for the possibility of something real. And later, much later, when they were alone in the suite they'd rented for the night, Elena looked at the man who'd gone from being her intimidating boss to her vulnerable partner, to her husband, and felt overwhelming gratitude for every moment that had brought them here. "I love you," she said simply, the words never losing their power no matter how many times she said them. "I love you," Damien replied, pulling her close, wrapping her in arms that had learned to hold instead of push away, "even though you still don't make things easy for me." "Especially because I don't make things easy," Elena corrected, and they laughed together, the sound filling their room with warmth and joy, and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd spend learning to love each other more deeply with each passing day. There's a truth we all need to learn, a lesson that Elena and Damien discovered through storm and struggle and the courage to be honest. We spend so much of our lives convinced we're too much or not enough, building walls to protect ourselves from rejection, wearing masks to hide the parts we think are unlovable. We make ourselves small when we're afraid of taking up too much space, or we make ourselves hard when we're terrified of being hurt, and we call it survival, call it protecting ourselves, call it being realistic. But real survival, real living, the kind that fills your soul instead of just passing time, comes from finding someone who sees all of you, who witnesses the messy and the magnificent, the broken and the beautiful, the parts you're proud of and the parts you're ashamed of, and chooses to stay. Not because they're fixing you or completing you or making you whole, because you were already whole, already complete, already enough, but because they recognize in you the same longing for acceptance that lives in them, the same fear of being too much or not enough, the same desperate hope that somewhere in this world is a person whose heart is vast enough to embrace all your contradictions, because they're brave enough to take off their own mask first and trust that you'll do the same, to show you their wounds and believe you won't use them as weapons, to admit they're scared and lonely and hoping for exactly what you're hoping for. Damien had been Elena's arrogant boss, cold and demanding, and seemingly uninterested in anything beyond perfection and productivity, and she'd been his efficient assistant, invisible by design, useful and valuable but always at a careful distance, never risking more than professional competence. But underneath those roles, underneath the armor they both wore to work every day, were two people desperate to be seen, to be known, to matter to someone beyond their utility or achievement. Two people carrying the same wound in different shapes, convinced they were destined for loneliness because no one would ever accept them completely. No one would ever see past their defenses to the vulnerability underneath and choose to stay. And then came a storm, unexpected and fierce, that trapped them together with nowhere to hide, no professional buffer to maintain the careful distance, no work to distract from the truth. And in that forced proximity, in that darkness lit only by candles, with the world outside raging and the world inside shifting, they'd found the courage to tell the truth, to admit that the distance between them wasn't indifference but fear, wasn't coldness but self-protection, wasn't professionalism but desperation not to risk the pain of wanting something they couldn't have. That's what love really is, not the fairy tale version where everything is easy and beautiful from the start, where two people meet and simply know and live happily ever after, with no complications or struggles. But the messy, terrifying, exhilarating reality of choosing to lower your walls for someone, even though they might hurt you, of believing that being truly known is worth the risk of being rejected, of trusting that somewhere in this world is a person whose heart is vast enough to embrace all your contradictions, all your flaws, all the parts of you that you've been taught to hide or apologize for or pretend don't exist. Damien stirred beside her in the darkness, his arms tightening around her unconsciously, even in sleep, and Elena smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought them here, from that first day when she'd walked nervously into his office to this night when they'd promised forever. They'd found each other not despite their wounds, but maybe because of them, because they both understood what it meant to hide, to protect, to believe you were fundamentally alone and unlovable, and that shared understanding had created a bridge between them that no amount of professional distance could ultimately destroy. She thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, walking into Damien's office for the first time, nervous and eager to prove herself, convinced that being useful was the only way to matter. She'd wanted his approval so desperately, wanted to be good enough, valuable enough, worth keeping. She'd made herself indispensable because she thought that was the only path to significance, the only way to ensure she wouldn't be dismissed or forgotten. And all along, she'd already mattered. Not for what she did, but for who she was, for the way she saw him clearly when everyone else only saw the image he projected. And Damien, her complicated, brilliant, damaged, beautiful husband, had spent so long convinced his intensity was a flaw that his demands and his drive and his inability to ever fully relax made him impossible to love. He'd built an empire as proof of his worth, as if achievement could fill the hollow place where acceptance should live, as if success could substitute for connection. He'd pushed people away before they could leave, convinced that loneliness chosen was better than loneliness inflicted, that controlling the narrative of his isolation was better than risking the vulnerability of truly needing someone. Until a storm forced him to be honest, until circumstances stripped away all his usual defenses, and he'd discovered that vulnerability wasn't the weakness he'd always feared, but the only path to real connection, to being known and loved instead of just admired and obeyed. They'd both been wrong about themselves, carrying narratives about their unworthiness that weren't true, but felt true because they'd been reinforced over years of protecting themselves from rejection. And maybe that's the real gift of love. Not that it makes us perfect or complete or whole, because those are illusions anyway, aspirations that set us up for disappointment, but that it gives us a mirror that reflects us more accurately than our own distorted self-perception ever could, shows us how we look through eyes that see us clearly and love what they see. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from, and if you felt it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt this story was really worth listening to, also click the Super Thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue creating stories that touch the soul. Stories that remind us we're not alone in our fears, not strange in our longings, not broken beyond repair. Because we all need stories that show us it's possible, that somewhere out there is a person who will see us clearly and stay, who will weather our storms, not because they have to, but because they choose to, who will love us not despite who we are, but because of who we are, in all our complicated, contradictory, beautifully human glory. We need to hear that the walls we've built to protect ourselves might also be the walls keeping us from everything we want most, that vulnerability is terrifying, but necessary, that the risk of being hurt is less painful in the long run than the certainty of being alone. Elena and Damien's story isn't unique, isn't special except to them. It's the story of every person who's ever felt like they were too much or not enough, every person who's hidden parts of themselves to be acceptable, every person who's chosen safety over authenticity because the alternative seemed too risky. But it's also the story of what happens when we're brave enough to be honest, when circumstances force us to drop our masks, and we discover that what's underneath is exactly what someone else has been searching for all along.